Hey everybody, Josh here at HDCircuitry. Just wanted to go over a couple things between my Big 3 stock location battery cable kit and my new starter harness cable kit versus the stock harness, just because there's been some questions on how the starter plays in with those cables versus the Big 3 kit. But I want to start with the stock harness just to show you. Here's a crude doodle of the factory harness on top of where components all go. So factory, you have your alternator. Obviously don't have the cable here, but there's a 4-gauge cable that goes from the alternator to the starter solenoid on the firewall that's got the 2 posts. So the OEM harness is all integrated battery and starter, and my kit's kind of split that out into 2 for purpose. So factory goes from that firewall solenoid that's fed from the alternator cable. There's also a cable that runs over to the fuse box. The battery cable is positive and negative. A fender ground that's tied in goes down through the fender well with some very cheap heat sleeving and plastic looming. And then at the starter itself, there's the solenoid on the side that 2 of the cables go to, one of the large and small ones under the red cap. And then there's another one that goes to the transmission mount near the engine for a ground, and then another one that loops over the frame to go to a ground in the passenger wheel well. It's kind of right behind the A-arm, and it also bolts to the bracket that holds this whole thing down. But as you can see, one integrated harness, but between the age of the trucks and the heat near everything, these get old and brittle and start to kind of crack and degrade, and increases the resistance of the cables and voltage drop increases. You get weaker voltage to the starter. Factory terminals get corroded, resistance increases, you get less voltage. So just over time, both your battery side and starter side just start degrading. So from that, I split this into 2 different kits, and I'll walk through the 2 kits and then how they integrate, or how you can just do one or the other. So easiest to start with my Big 3 kit. Just like on the factory setup, comes from the alternator. Instead of a 4-gauge, it's 1/0, and it goes from the alternator to the starter solenoid on the firewall. Same exact routing. It goes to the bottom post on the starter solenoid. Then from the starter solenoid, runs over. Instead of a fusible link in the factory one, I use an ANN fuse and mount and protective boots and everything else. A lot of guys mount this right on the battery box. And then from there runs to the positive battery post. From the negative battery post, just run over ground to the firewall. I also add an auxiliary engine ground from the frame to the block. And for the starter cables, because I said OEM's all integrated, my kit's split out. You'll cut the starter cables out of the OEM harness and reuse them. And I provide 4-gauge terminals to crimp on and heat shrink, and the top one from that plastic U-shaped piece. And you crimp in your factory starter cables here. So you can use the Big 3 kit or my drag relocation kit with the factory battery cables or starter cables. With my starter cable upgrade harness that I now have, again, primarily driven from the age of the trucks and just building a cleaner harness, but this also has upgrades with better heat sleeving and increased gauge wiring for less voltage drop. I go to 2-gauge instead of 4-gauge. This integrates in pretty seamless. So the only thing you lose from buying these kits separate is you won't use this, and this. That's the only thing lost by buying these kits separate. Even if you buy them together, you're still going to get those extra lugs. You're just not going to use them. So my starter harness, it's all integrated in. So this part's going to go to the firewall ground, just like this one used to do manually. This one's going to go to the bottom post on the starter solenoid, just like this one used to do. And this one's going to go to the top solenoid post, just like this one used to do. The rest of the harness routes down through the engine bay, and then down between the wheel well, past the header, down to the starter. So the starter has a smaller solenoid mounted on the body. The 2-gauge cable will mount to the big post. The smaller cable will mount to the smaller post. This will mount to the ground at the engine and transmission location, just like the factory one did. And this will loop back up over the frame rail and bolt to the ground in the factory location. And you can also utilize the clamp to replace the factory metal bracket and it all goes together. So everything uses OEM connections. Nothing's drastically changed. Just upgraded cabling, and they integrate in nicely. Like I said, the only thing lost is these 3 connections that you will now no longer have to crimp yourselves and reuse your factory starter cables if you want to add in my starter cables. So if you already have my big 3 kit, you can add the starter cable kit and simply unbolt these connections that you've done on the starter cables. If you buy them together, you can skip having to cut anything out of your factory harness to reuse starter cables because you'll have both kits fully terminated. Essentially, this was replacing that, this was replacing that, and this was replacing that. So I hope that helps clarify a bit of any of the questions or confusion between the different kits. And again, the starter cable upgrade kit will work with both the factory location big 3 kit, or this is unsleeved here, not finished, but a drag relocation kit for the back. So any other questions, just let me know. Just hope this helped clarify the difference between the 2 different kits and how they kind of integrate in together as well.